The whip cracked across the mud just inches from her bare feet, and the girl did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only made the punishment last longer. Kneel, stay quiet, wait for it to end. That was the only lesson the Draven pack had ever taught her, and she had learned it better than any other lesson in her short, hard life. 12, the overseer barked. The hounds need feeding before the guests arrive. Move faster, or you will feel this again. She rose without a word, her knees stiff from the cold stone floor of the kennels, and hurried toward the feed shed. 12. That was her name here. Not a name at all, really. Just a number stitched onto a scrap of cloth she wore around her wrist, so the pack would always know which discarded child she was. She had been born the daughter of an Omega who fled from a rival pack and an Alpha who wanted nothing to do with either of them. The pack elders decided, before she could even walk, that a child born of shame did not deserve a name. Numbers were for livestock, and for her. 19 years she had carried that number. 19 years of scrubbing floors, hauling water, mending fences, and disappearing into the background of a household that pretended she did not exist, unless they needed something scrubbed, fed, or fixed. Her half-siblings, the true-born children of the Alpha, wore silk and gold, and never once looked her in the eye. Not out of guilt, out of habit. She was furniture to them, and furniture did not need a name. Today the estate buzzed with an energy she had never felt before. Servants ran back and forth polishing silver, arranging flowers, and shouting orders at each other in tones sharp with nerves. The Draven pack was hosting the Unity Hunt, an ancient tradition where neighboring packs gathered once a year to hunt together, feast together, and remind each other that peace between their lands still held. This year, the guest of honor was not just any pack leader. This year, the Alpha King himself was coming. She had heard the name whispered in the kitchens with something close to reverence. Kael Ashborn, a king who ruled not one pack, but an entire kingdom of packs, bound together under his protection. Powerful enough that even the proudest alphas in the Draven household lowered their voices when they spoke of him. She had no reason to care. Kings did not notice Omegas who cleaned kennels. Kings did not notice girls without names. She fed the hounds quickly, checking each one for injuries as she always did, because no one else bothered to. One of the younger dogs limped toward her, whimpering, a thorn buried deep in its paw. She knelt in the mud without hesitation, cupping its trembling leg in her hands, murmuring softly until it calmed enough to let her work the thorn free. The hound licked her wrist in gratitude, and for a moment, in the quiet of the kennel, she allowed herself to feel something like peace. Animals never asked for her name. Animals only asked for kindness, and kindness was the one thing she had plenty of to give. She did not hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across the mud beside her. "That paw looks bad," a deep voice said. "You handled it well." She froze, then looked up, and her breath caught somewhere in her throat. The man standing above her was unlike anyone she had ever seen at the estate. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark traveling clothes that were simple but clearly expensive, with an air about him that made the hounds themselves go quiet and alert. His eyes were a deep, storm-colored gray, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She scrambled to her feet and bowed her head immediately, the way she had been trained since childhood. "Forgive me, sir. I did not hear you approach. There is nothing to forgive." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something watchful. "I only meant to walk the grounds before the feast. I did not expect to find someone actually caring for these animals, instead of simply feeding them." She did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever complimented her work before, not once in 19 years. She kept her eyes down, unsure if looking at him directly was even allowed. "The hounds do their work well, sir. It is only right that someone looks after them properly." "And who looks after you?" The question hit her like a slap, not because it was unkind, but because it was so unexpected that she genuinely did not have an answer. No one looked after her. No one ever had. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally settled on the only truthful thing she could say. "I look after myself, sir." Something shifted in his expression then, something she could not quite read, gone as quickly as it appeared. Before he could say anything further, a sharp voice called out from across the courtyard. "Your Majesty, forgive me. I did not realize you had wandered from the main hall." She looked up to see the estate's head steward hurrying toward them, bowing so low, his nose nearly touched his knees. "Your Majesty." Her stomach dropped. This was him. This was the Alpha King, standing in the mud of the kennels, talking to her as though she were an actual person and not a number stitched onto cloth. "I was simply admiring the grounds," the king said smoothly, though his gray eyes flicked once more toward her, before he turned to follow the steward. "Your kennels are well kept. You should commend whoever is responsible." The steward laughed nervously. "Ah, that would be one of the servant girls, Your Majesty. Nothing of importance. Please, come. The Alpha and his family are eager to welcome you properly." Nothing of importance. She had heard those words about herself more times than she could count, and yet hearing them now, in front of this stranger who had just spoken to her as though she mattered, stung in a way she was not prepared for. She watched the king walk away, his broad shoulders rigid, and told herself it did not matter what a king thought of her. Kings came and went. Her life would remain the same regardless. But she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to find. The rest of the day passed in a blur of exhausting labor. She was pulled from the kennels to help prepare the feast hall, carrying heavy trays of dishes she would never be allowed to taste, arranging flowers she would never be allowed to wear, and polishing silverware that would touch the lips of guests who did not know her name because she did not have one. By the time the sun began to set and the great hall filled with the low murmur of important voices, she was standing against the far wall with the other unranked servants, exhausted, filthy, and invisible. The Alpha of the Draven Pack, a broad and commanding man named Garrick, stood at the head of the hall welcoming his guests with the kind of warmth he only ever showed to people who mattered. Beside him stood his wife and his true-born children, dressed in colors so rich they seemed to glow in the candlelight. And across from them, seated in the place of highest honor, was the Alpha King. Cale Ashbourne looked different now, dressed in formal attire that made him seem even more imposing than he had in the kennel yard. But his eyes kept drifting, scanning the room as though searching for something, or someone. She told herself it was nothing. Kings did that. They surveyed rooms out of habit, out of caution, not because they were looking for a girl with mud still under her fingernails. "Alpha Garrick," the king said during a lull in the conversation, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "I understand it is tradition for the host pack to introduce each of the Omegas present. I would like to observe that tradition, if you do not mind." A ripple of excitement went through the room. This was expected. Every year, unmated Omegas from allied packs were presented to visiting dignitaries. A subtle but well-understood custom, meant to encourage matches between powerful families. Alpha Garrick's face lit up with obvious pride as he gestured for his 3 unmated Omega daughters to step forward, each of them dressed in silk, each of them smiling with practiced grace. "Of course, Your Majesty. My daughters, Ivy, Nora, and Lena, each a treasure of the Draven line." The king inclined his head politely to each of them, offering pleasant but distant words. She watched from the wall, unbothered, expecting this to be the entirety of the tradition. But then the king's gray eyes swept the room once more, past the daughters, past the other visiting Omegas seated at their tables, and landed on her. "And her?" he asked, nodding directly toward the servants' wall. The hall went silent. Alpha Garrick's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered it, though his eyes had gone hard. "Your Majesty, that is only a servant girl. There is no need to trouble yourself with introductions there." "Every Omega present," the king said evenly, "was the agreement. Was it not? I would like to know her name." The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. She felt every eye in the hall shift toward her, felt her face burn with a humiliation, so familiar, it had become almost numbing over the years. Alpha Garrick cleared his throat, clearly searching for a way to deflect, but there was no graceful way to explain what everyone in that hall already knew. "She does not have a name, Your Majesty," he finally said, his tone clipped with irritation. "She was never given one. A matter of pack tradition, nothing more." The king's expression did not change, not outwardly, but something in the air around him seemed to sharpen, like the moment before a storm breaks. "No name," he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. "In 19 years, no one in this household thought to give a child a name." "It is not so unusual, Your Majesty," Garrick said, his voice tight. "She is the daughter of a runaway Omega, unclaimed by her father. The elders determined." "I did not ask for the elders' reasoning," the king interrupted, and though his voice remained calm, the authority in it was unmistakable. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. I asked why a living person has been denied something as basic as a name. No one answered. Garrick's jaw worked silently, caught between his pride and the very real danger of offending a king whose favor his entire pack depended on. She stood frozen against the wall, wishing desperately that the floor would open and swallow her whole, wishing she had never been noticed at all. This was worse than being invisible. This was being seen, truly seen, in front of everyone, as the thing she had always been told she was, nothing. The king's gaze found her again, across the hall, and this time, there was something in it she did not recognize, something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not name. It was not pity. She had received plenty of pity over the years, and this was not that. It looked almost like anger, but not directed at her. Directed at the room, at the tradition, at every person who had ever looked at her and decided she was not worth the effort of a name. "I believe," the king said finally, turning back to his hosts as though nothing unusual had happened at all, "that I would like to tour the grounds before the meal continues. Alone, if you do not mind." Alpha Garrick, clearly relieved to have the tension broken, agreed immediately, and the feast resumed its normal rhythm around her. But she noticed, as the king rose from his seat and made his way toward the hall's side doors, that his path led directly past the servants' wall. Directly past her. He did not stop. He did not speak. But as he passed, his eyes met hers one final time, and in that brief moment, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something she had not felt in 19 years of being nothing more than a number. She felt, for the first time in her life, like she had been seen. The night was far from over, and she had no way of knowing that the man who had just walked past her would change the entire course of her life before the sun rose again. All she knew, standing there in the flickering candlelight with her heart pounding against her ribs, was that something had shifted in the world, and she was terrified and hopeful in equal measure to find out what it meant. She did not sleep that night. Long after the feast ended, and the last of the guests retired to their guest quarters, she lay on her thin cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the cracked wooden ceiling, replaying the moment the king's eyes had met hers. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings noticed unusual things sometimes. A servant without a name was unusual. That was all it was. But her heart refused to believe the story her mind was telling it. The morning brought the unity hunt itself, a tradition older than any pack currently living. Alphas and their chosen hunters would ride out into the eastern forest to track a great stag, a symbolic gesture meant to represent the strength and cooperation of the gathered packs. Omegas were not permitted to hunt, of course, but they were expected to prepare the celebratory feast that would follow, which meant she spent the early hours hauling baskets of vegetables from the storehouse to the kitchens, her arms aching under the weight. She was crossing the eastern courtyard, balancing a basket against her hip, when she nearly collided with someone coming the opposite direction. She stumbled back with a gasp of apology already forming on her lips, only to realize it was him. The king, dressed now in riding leathers, his dark hair slightly windblown as though he had already been outside. "Forgive me," she said quickly, bowing her head and stepping aside to let him pass. "You should be more careful," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only something gentler. "That basket looks heavier than you are." "I manage, sir." "You manage a great many things, it seems." He studied her for a moment, and she felt that same prickling awareness she had felt in the kennel yard the day before, as though he were seeing something in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for. "The hunt does not leave for another hour. Walk with me a moment. I have questions. And I suspect the answers I received last night were not the whole truth." She hesitated. Servants did not simply walk with kings. But refusing a direct request from the Alpha King seemed far more dangerous than accepting one, so she set her basket down carefully and followed him toward the quiet edge of the courtyard, near the old stone fountain that had not worked properly in years. "Tell me your story," he said, once they were out of easy earshot of the estate's windows. "Not the version the elders decided upon. Yours." No one had ever asked her that before. She found herself hesitating, unsure how to even begin, unsure if the truth was something she was allowed to say out loud, but something about the steadiness in his gray eyes made the words come anyway, slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam that had held for far too long. She told him about her mother, an Omega who had fled a rival pack years before she was born, seeking safety with the Draven pack, and finding, instead, an Alpha who took what he wanted and offered nothing in return. She told him how her mother disappeared before she turned 2, leaving her to be raised, if it could be called that, by a household that resented her existence as a living reminder of scandal. She told him about growing up nameless, about the number stitched onto cloth, about learning to disappear into corners so she would not draw punishment for simply existing. She had never said any of it aloud before. It felt strange, dangerous even, like handing a stranger a piece of herself she could never take back. But the king listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at certain parts of the story, his expression unreadable but intent, as though every word mattered to him in a way she could not understand. "And in 19 years, he said quietly when she finished, no one thought to change this. "It is not my place to question the elders, sir." "Perhaps not," he said, and there was something dangerous beneath the calm of his voice now, something that made her understand, suddenly, why an entire kingdom of packs bowed to this man. "But it is mine." Before she could ask what he meant, a scent reached her, faint at first, carried on the morning breeze, and she watched as his entire posture changed. He went very still, his nostrils flaring slightly, his gray eyes darkening, as they fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly nervous. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a single step closer, close enough that she could see the faint gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough that her own instincts, dulled by years of suppression and exhaustion, began to stir, with something she did not recognize. A warmth, low and unfamiliar, spreading through her chest. "Your scent," he said finally, his voice rougher than before. "Has anyone ever told you what your scent is?" She shook her head slowly. Omegas without status were rarely permitted close enough to alphas of consequence for such things to be discussed. She had always assumed her scent was as unremarkable as everything else about her. "It is not unremarkable," he said, as though he had read the thought directly from her mind. "It is rare, rarer than anything I have encountered in all my years as king." He exhaled slowly, visibly working to steady himself. "I need to think. I need to be certain before I say anything more. But I need you to know that everything is about to change, and I am sorry that I cannot yet tell you how." Before she could ask him to explain, the sound of horns echoed across the estate, signaling that the hunting party was assembling. His expression shifted instantly back to the composed, regal mask she had seen the night before, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he turned to go. "Stay close to the estate today," he said over his shoulder. "I will find you again before the hunt's feast tonight." She stood alone by the broken fountain long after he disappeared, her heart pounding, her mind spinning through everything he had said and everything he had not. Rare. Everything is about to change. She did not understand what any of it meant, not fully, but for the first time in her entire life, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The hunt lasted most of the day, and she spent the hours trying, and failing, to focus on her usual chores. Twice, she nearly dropped trays of dishes, her mind wandering back to the strange intensity in the king's eyes, the way his voice had roughened when he spoke of her scent. She told herself she was imagining significance where there was none. Kings did not concern themselves with nameless servant girls, no matter how they smelled. But when the hunting party returned at dusk, triumphant and loud with the energy of a successful hunt, she caught sight of the king dismounting his horse, and his eyes found hers instantly across the crowded courtyard, as though he had been searching for her the moment he arrived. He did not approach her, not with so many witnesses present, but the look he gave her carried a promise she could not begin to interpret. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air, the same way animals could feel a storm, long before the clouds arrived. And for the first time in 19 years of being nothing, being no one, being simply a number, stitched onto cloth, she found herself terrified, not of what might be taken from her, but of what she might actually be allowed to have. The closing feast of the Unity Hunt was the grandest event the Draven estate hosted all year, and this year, it carried a tension beneath its surface that only a handful of people in the hall could sense. She stood against the servants' wall exactly where she had stood the night before, exhausted from a full day of preparation, her arms sore, her feet aching, but her mind sharper and more alert than it had ever been. The king had told her something was coming. She did not know what, but she found herself watching him from across the hall, the same way she imagined prey watched a predator, not out of fear, but out of an instinct too old and too strong to ignore. Alpha Garrick stood at the head of the room, raising a goblet in celebration of the successful hunt, praising his hunters, praising the alliance between the packs, praising everything except the one thing that actually mattered to her. She barely listened. Her attention kept drifting to the king, who sat with unusual stillness, his gray eyes distant, as though he were working through a decision of enormous weight. The meal passed slowly. Course after course was served, and she and the other unranked servants moved quietly along the edges of the hall, refilling goblets and clearing plates, invisible as always. She had almost convinced herself that whatever the king intended had somehow passed, that perhaps he had reconsidered whatever strange impulse had gripped him that morning by the fountain, when he suddenly rose from his seat. The hall quieted instantly. A king rising unprompted during a feast was not something anyone ignored. "Alpha Garrick," the king said, his voice carrying easily across the silence. "I have a matter I wish to address before this gathering concludes, and I would ask for your patience while I do." Garrick straightened, clearly caught off guard, but recovering his composure quickly. "Of course, your majesty. Please, speak freely." The king's gray eyes swept the hall, and she felt her stomach drop when they settled, once again, on her. Every head in the room turned to follow his gaze, and she felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her chest, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to become as small and unnoticeable as possible. But something in his expression stopped her. There was no cruelty in it, no intention to expose her for sport. There was something else entirely, something steady and certain. "Yesterday," the king began, "I asked this household to introduce every unmated Omega present, and I was told that one among you had no name at all. I found that unacceptable then, and I find it unacceptable now, but I have since learned something further, something that changes the nature of my visit here considerably." Whispers rippled through the hall. Garrick's expression had gone carefully neutral, the way it always did when he sensed danger he could not yet identify. "I have spent 19 years searching, quietly and without success, for something every Alpha King is meant to find eventually," the king continued. "A fated mate, I had begun to believe, as many in my position eventually do, that I was destined to rule alone, bound to duty rather than to another soul." He paused, and his eyes, when they found hers again, had softened into something she had never seen directed at her before. Something that looked, impossibly, like reverence. "I no longer believe that." The hall erupted into murmurs, but the king did not stop, did not waver, though she stood frozen against the wall, with her heart hammering so violently, she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "The bond does not care for status, or wealth, or the names we give ourselves and each other," he said. "It found her in a kennel yard, tending an injured hound, with more gentleness than I have witnessed in any court in my kingdom. It found her in a girl this household saw fit to deny even the smallest dignity of a name." He crossed the hall now, his steps unhurried but purposeful, and the crowd parted around him, as though pulled by some invisible current. "I do not intend to leave this estate without her." She could not breathe. She could not move. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the certainty in his eyes was not madness, not some cruel trick, but something entirely, terrifyingly real. "I cannot give you back the years that were taken from you," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her now, though the entire hall strained to hear. "But I can promise you, every year that comes after this one, I can promise you a name of your own choosing, a place that is truly yours, and a mate who will never allow you to be treated as nothing again." He extended his hand toward her, palm open, waiting. "If you will have me." The hall was silent enough that she could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. Every eye in the room, every eye that had once looked through her as though she did not exist, was now fixed entirely on her, waiting to see what a nameless servant girl would do when offered a crown. She looked past the king's outstretched hand to the faces watching her. Garrick, pale with fury he was struggling to contain in front of his royal guest, her half-siblings, staring in open shock, the elders who had decided, before she could even speak, that she deserved nothing at all. And then she looked back at the king, at the steadiness in his gray eyes, at the promise she had felt building since the moment he first knelt beside her in the mud to ask about an injured hound. She placed her hand in his. The moment their palms touched, something surged through her, warm and electric, a sensation she had no words for, because nothing in her life had ever prepared her to feel it. The bond, she would later understand, settling into place like a missing piece finally returning home. His fingers closed around hers, firm and certain, and for the first time in 19 years, she did not feel like a number, or a burden, or a shameful secret to be hidden away. She felt like she belonged to someone who had chosen her, freely and completely, exactly as she was. "Your Majesty," Garrick began, stepping forward with poorly disguised alarm. "Surely you understand the complications of such a declaration. She is unranked, untitled, she has no family standing to offer. No. She has everything that matters," the king said, cutting him off without raising his voice, though the authority in it silenced the Alpha instantly. "And you, Alpha Garrick, have a great deal to answer for regarding how she has been treated in this household. We will discuss that further before I depart. For tonight, I would ask that this gathering recognize her as what she now is, my mate, and the future queen of the Ashbourne Kingdom." The hall remained frozen in stunned silence, but she barely noticed. She was looking up at the man who, less than 2 days ago, had been a stranger kneeling beside her in the mud, and who now stood holding her hand, as though it were the most precious thing in his entire kingdom. Whatever came next, whatever complications and dangers awaited them, she understood, with sudden, overwhelming clarity, that her life, the one she had spent 19 years enduring, rather than living, had just changed forever. She still did not have a name. But for the first time, she was beginning to believe she might finally be given the chance to choose one. They left the Draven estate the following morning, and she rode beside the king in a carriage finer than anything she had ever touched, let alone sat inside. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, still half convinced she would wake up back on her thin cot in the servants' quarters and discover the entire feast, the entire declaration, had been nothing more than an exhausted, hopeful dream. "You are quiet," the king said, watching her from across the carriage, with an attentiveness she was not yet used to. "I am still trying to understand that this is real, sir." "Cale," he corrected gently, "not sir." "Not your Majesty. Not when it is only the two of us. Cale." She tested the name silently in her mind before speaking it aloud, feeling strange and bold saying it at all. Cale. He smiled at that, a small, genuine thing that transformed his usually composed expression into something warmer, younger. "Better," he said. "And to answer your question, yes, this is real. I understand. It must feel impossible. I imagine very little in your life has ever gone the way it should." She looked down at her hands, still rough and calloused from years of labor. "Nothing has ever gone the way I hoped. No, I stopped hoping for very much, a long time ago." "That will change," he said, and there was no arrogance in the way he said it, only quiet certainty. "I intend to spend a great deal of time making certain of it." The journey to the Ashbourne Kingdom took the better part of 2 days, and with each passing mile, she felt the tight, defensive posture she had carried her entire life beginning, slowly and cautiously, to ease. Cale did not press her to talk when she was tired. He did not demand gratitude or performance the way she had feared, deep down, that even a kind master might. He simply existed beside her, steady and patient, occasionally sharing small pieces of his own life, the weight of ruling an entire kingdom, the loneliness of searching 19 years for a bond he had begun to believe did not exist for him. "I want you to understand something," he said, as their carriage rolled through the final stretch of forest, before the Ashbourne territory came into view. "I am not asking you to become someone else to fit into this life. I am not interested in molding you into whatever image a queen is supposed to hold. I found you exactly as you are, kneeling in mud, caring for a wounded animal, with more gentleness than most alphas show their own kin. That is who I want beside me." "I do not even know who that is," she admitted quietly. "I have spent my whole life being told I am nothing. I do not know how to be anything else." "Then we will discover it together," he said simply. "There is no rush. You have an entire lifetime ahead of you to figure out who you are. free of everything that was done to you. The Ashbourne estate, when it finally came into view, took her breath away, in a manner entirely different from the fear that had gripped her upon first meeting the king. It was not simply grand, though it was that, with towers of pale stone rising against a mountain backdrop and gardens stretching in every direction, vibrant even in the fading light of evening. It felt, somehow, warm, alive in a way the Draven estate, for all its wealth, had never once felt to her. Servants and staff gathered at the entrance to greet their king's return, and she braced herself instinctively for the same dismissive glances she had endured her entire life, the same subtle cruelty dressed up as politeness. Instead, she found curious, welcoming faces, a few surprised whispers quickly hushed, and one older woman, who stepped forward and bowed deeply before Cale had even finished helping her down from the carriage. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," the woman said warmly, before turning her attention fully to the girl beside him. "And welcome to you, my lady. I am Mira, head of the household staff. If there is anything at all you require, you have only to ask." My lady. She had never been called that in her entire life. She did not quite know how to respond, offering only a small, uncertain nod, but Mira's expression remained kind, patient, entirely without judgment. "She is not yet accustomed to kindness," Cale said quietly, his hand resting gently at the small of her back, as he guided her toward the estate's entrance. "I would ask that everyone here extend her the patience such an adjustment requires." "Of course, Your Majesty," Mira said, and though her voice was steady, her eyes, when they briefly met the girl's, held something warm and understanding, as though she recognized more of this story than had been explained to her. That evening, after a meal shared quietly in Cale's private chambers, rather than a formal hall filled with watching eyes, he brought up something that had clearly been weighing on him since the moment she first told him her story. "You need a name," he said gently. "Your own, chosen freely, belonging to no one and nothing but yourself." She had thought about this during the journey, turning the idea over carefully, cautiously, still half afraid it would be snatched away before she could fully claim it. "I do not know how to choose something so important. I have never been allowed to choose anything before." "Then take your time," he said. "There is no deadline. This is not a title I am assigning you. It is a gift I am returning, one that was always meant to be yours." She thought of her childhood, brief and scattered memories of moments stolen in quiet corners, away from the harsh eyes of the estate. She thought of winter mornings, so cold her breath fogged in the kennel air, and the small, stubborn birds that nested in the eaves above the stable, singing even when frost coated every branch around them, refusing to be silenced by circumstances that should have crushed them entirely. "Wren," she said softly, testing the word the way she had tested his name in the carriage. "I would like to be called Wren." Cale repeated it back to her, slow and deliberate, as though committing something sacred to memory. "Wren," he said. "It suits you, small, but far stronger than anyone realizes, until it is too late for them to underestimate you further." For the first time in 19 years, she smiled without restraint, without fear of punishment, following close behind the expression. Wren. It was hers, chosen freely, belonging to no one but herself, exactly as Cale had promised. And as she sat there in the quiet warmth of a home that already felt more like family than the estate she had spent her entire life in ever had, she allowed herself, cautiously but completely, to believe that this new life might truly be as real as it felt. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Wren had never known was possible. She woke each morning in a bedroom, larger than the entire servants' quarters she had once shared with a dozen other overworked staff. Sunlight pouring through tall windows, instead of the thin cracks she had once relied on to guess the time. Mira, gentle and endlessly patient, helped her learn the customs of the Ashbourne court, without ever once making her feel foolish for not already knowing them. But Cale was not content simply to give her a new life and leave the past behind unexamined. Late one evening, nearly 2 weeks after their arrival, he found her in the estate's library, curled into a window seat with a book she was only half reading, her mind drifting, as it often still did, back to the years she had spent believing herself worthless. "I have been making inquiries," he said, settling into the seat across from her, his expression carefully measured in a way that immediately told her something significant was coming. "About your mother." Wren's breath caught. She had not spoken of her mother since the morning by the broken fountain, had not allowed herself to dwell on the woman who vanished before she was old enough to form any real memory of her. "What did you find?" "Her name was Elowin," Cale said gently. "She came from the Halimere Pack, several territories east of Dravenland. According to the records I have gathered, she did not abandon you willingly, as you were told." He paused, watching her carefully, giving her space to absorb what he had already said before continuing. "She was forced out. Alpha Garrick's father, who ruled before him, discovered she was carrying a child that was not sanctioned by any formal mating agreement, and rather than allow the scandal to touch his household publicly, he had her removed, quietly, permanently." "Removed," Wren repeated slowly, her stomach twisting with a dread she did not yet fully understand. "You mean she did not run away at all?" "I mean," Cale said, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger, "that she was taken from you, Wren. Not because she did not want you, because a man who valued his reputation more than either of your lives decided you were both an inconvenience worth erasing." Wren sat in stunned silence, the foundation of everything she had believed about herself, about her own worth, cracking apart beneath the weight of this new truth. She had spent 19 years believing she was the product of abandonment, that even her own mother had looked at her and chosen to leave. To learn instead that her existence itself had been the crime, that the shame she had carried her entire life belonged not to her mother, and certainly not to her, but to a household that punished a child for surviving circumstances entirely beyond her control, was almost too much to process at once. "Is she still alive?" Wren asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Cale's expression softened with something close to sorrow. "I do not know yet. The trail grows difficult to follow after she was removed from Halimere territory. But I promise you this, I will not stop searching until I have an answer, whatever that answer turns out to be." Wren reached across the space between them and took his hand, something she still was not entirely used to doing, still marveling at the fact that she was allowed to reach for comfort at all, without fear of punishment following close behind. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for looking, for caring enough to look, when no one else in my life ever did. You are my mate," Cale said simply, as though this explained everything, and in many ways, to him, it clearly did. "Everything that concerns you concerns me. I will not rest until every wrong done to you has been made right, as much as it is within my power to make right." The following weeks brought a steady stream of changes, each one chipping away further at the walls Wren had spent her entire life building around herself. Cale insisted she be taught to read and write properly, something the Draven household had never bothered to provide her, and she found herself surprisingly quick with letters and numbers once given the chance to actually learn. He introduced her, slowly and carefully, to members of his court, always staying close by her side during those early, nerve-wracking encounters, always ready to step in if anyone treated her with anything less than the respect she was due. Not everyone welcomed her easily. She caught whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, noticed the way certain nobles' eyes lingered too long on her still calloused hands, the evidence of years of labor that no amount of fine clothing could fully erase. But for every skeptical glance, there were far more genuine ones, staff and courtiers alike who seemed, gradually, to see past her uncertain beginnings and recognize the quiet strength Cale had noticed in her from the very start. It was Mira who eventually told her the full story of why the household had accepted her so readily, sitting with her one afternoon in the estate's sunlit kitchen, while helping her practice the proper way to address visiting dignitaries. "Our king has waited 19 years for a bond most of us assumed would never come," Mira said, kneading bread dough with practiced ease. "He has ruled this kingdom faithfully, generously, but always with a certain loneliness beneath the surface, the kind that comes from carrying every burden alone. When he returned from Draven territory and told us what he had found, told us how you had been treated, there was not a single person in this household who did not immediately understand why he could not simply walk away. I still worry I do not belong here," Wren admitted quietly. "I spent so long being told I was nothing, that it is difficult to believe I could actually be something else entirely." Mira paused her work and looked at her with an expression of genuine warmth. "Belonging is not something given to you by a title or a birthright, my lady. It is something you build, day by day, through the way you treat the people around you, and from what I have seen these past weeks, you have already built more genuine kindness in this household than some who were born into it ever managed in a lifetime." Ren thought about those words often in the days that followed, holding them close during moments of doubt, using them as a foundation to stand on when the old fears threatened to resurface. She was not yet entirely free of the girl who had knelt in the mud, answering to a number instead of a name. But with every kindness extended to her, every patient lesson, every moment Cale chose her again, deliberately and without hesitation, she felt that girl's shadow growing smaller, replaced slowly by someone new. Someone who was beginning, cautiously but genuinely, to believe she deserved the life she had been given. Word of Ren's new life traveled quickly across the Packlands, faster than Cale had anticipated, and not all of it traveled kindly. A courier arrived at the Ashbourne estate on a cold morning, nearly a month after their arrival, bearing a sealed letter from Alpha Garrick himself, and Ren watched from across the room as Cale's expression darkened while he read it. "What does it say?" she asked, setting down the book she had been practicing her reading with. Cale folded the letter slowly, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. "Garrick claims there has been a misunderstanding. He insists you were never truly denied a name, only that the matter was overlooked amid the household's many responsibilities. He requests that you return to Draven territory for a formal reconciliation, to smooth over what he calls, and I quote, an unfortunate misrepresentation of pack tradition to a valued royal guest." Ren felt something cold settle in her stomach. He wants to make it look like nothing happened. Like I was simply forgotten instead of deliberately denied. "Yes," Cale said grimly, "and worse, there are already rumors spreading through several territories, whispers that you somehow manipulated your way into my favor, that a servant girl could not possibly have earned a genuine mate bond through anything other than trickery or ambition." The accusation stung more than Ren expected it to, old fears rushing back with sudden force. She had spent her entire life being told her existence was a burden, a shameful secret to be hidden. Now, apparently, the story had shifted, but the underlying message remained painfully familiar. She did not deserve the life she had been given. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Cale's expression softened as he crossed the room and took her hands in his. "We do nothing that suggests you have anything to apologize for, because you do not. I will not have you paraded back to that estate to soothe Garrick's wounded pride, nor will I allow rumors born of jealousy and prejudice to define how this kingdom understands you." He paused, considering, "But I do think it is time the full truth was made known, publicly and undeniably, so that no one can twist this story into something it is not." Over the following days, Cale began quietly gathering evidence, calling upon contacts across several territories to confirm the details surrounding Ren's mother, the deliberate denial of her name, the years of documented mistreatment that Garrick's household had allowed, and in many cases encouraged. Ren found herself both grateful and unsettled by the process, grateful that someone was finally taking her history seriously, unsettled by how much of her painful past was being laid bare for others to examine. "You do not have to be involved in every part of this, if it is too much," Cale told her one evening, noticing the strain on her face after a long day of testimony gathering. "I can handle this without requiring you to relive every detail." "No," Ren said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "I have spent my entire life letting other people decide what my story means. I want to be part of deciding how it ends." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering across his features. "Then we will do this together, exactly as you wish." Not everyone in Cale's court agreed with his approach. During a private council meeting Ren was permitted to observe, several advisors raised concerns about the political risks of publicly confronting an allied pack over what they considered an internal family matter. "With respect, Your Majesty," one older advisor said carefully, "exposing Alpha Garrick's household so openly risks straining an alliance this kingdom has relied upon for generations. Perhaps a quieter resolution would serve everyone better." "A quieter resolution," Cale repeated, his voice deceptively calm in the way Ren had come to recognize as dangerous, "would mean allowing a man who denied a child her very name, who allowed her to be treated as property for 19 years, to escape any accountability whatsoever, simply because confronting him publicly is politically inconvenient." He looked around the room, meeting each advisor's eyes in turn. "I will not build my reign on the comfort of powerful men at the expense of those they have harmed. If this alliance cannot withstand basic accountability, then it was never as strong as we believed it to be. The room fell silent, and Ren felt a fierce, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, watching this powerful man defend her so completely, so unapologetically, in front of people whose opinions clearly mattered to the stability of his kingdom. No one had ever fought for her before. She had spent her entire life being the reason others made excuses, the inconvenience to be quietly managed rather than a person worth defending. That night, unable to sleep, she found Kale on the estate's private balcony, staring out at the moonlit mountains beyond the garden walls. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, joining him at the railing. "I do not want to be the reason you lose important allies." Kale turned to face her fully, his expression gentle but resolute. "Ren, listen to me carefully. You are not a complication I am managing. You are not a risk I am weighing against political convenience. You are my mate, and the way you were treated was a genuine injustice, one that deserves to be addressed regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for the people responsible." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that still, even now, caught her off guard. "I did not choose you despite the difficulty of your past. I choose you because of the strength it took to survive it, and I intend to make certain the world understands exactly what that survival cost you." Ren leaned into his touch, allowing herself, finally, to fully believe the words he kept offering her, again and again, with a consistency her entire life had never once provided. Whatever came next, whatever confrontation awaited them, when the truth was finally brought fully into the light, she would not be facing it alone. For the first time in her life, she had someone standing beside her, unwavering, ready to fight for a place in the world she had once believed she would never be allowed to have. The search for Ren's mother finally yielded a breakthrough nearly 2 months after Kale first began his inquiries. A messenger arrived from the Northern Territories, bearing news that made Kale's expression shift from cautious hope to something far more urgent the moment he finished reading. "They found her," he said, looking up at Ren with an intensity that made her heart race. "Elowen, she is alive, living under a different name, in a small village near the northern border, far from any packed territory that might recognize her." Ren's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table between them. 19 years of believing herself abandoned, and now, suddenly, the possibility that the woman who gave birth to her was not only alive but findable, felt almost too enormous to process. "Does she know?" Ren asked, her voice barely steady. "About me? About what happened?" "I do not know what she knows," Kale admitted, "but I intend to find out, if you wish it. This is your decision entirely, Ren. I will not push you toward a reunion you are not ready for, nor will I keep this information from you, if you would rather leave the past undisturbed." Ren sat with the question for several long moments, feeling the full weight of 19 years pressing against her chest. Part of her, the part still shaped by a childhood of rejection, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of further abandonment, wanted to leave the wound sealed, rather than risk tearing it open again. But a larger part of her, the part that had spent her entire life without answers, without a mother's face to remember, without a single explanation for why she had grown up alone, needed to know the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. "I want to see her," Ren said finally. "I need to know why. I need to hear it from her, not just from records and testimonies gathered by strangers." Kale nodded, immediately setting arrangements into motion. Within days, they were traveling north, a small, carefully chosen escort accompanying them to protect against any lingering threats from Draven loyalists who remained unhappy about the public reckoning Kale had orchestrated in the weeks prior. Alpha Garrick's household had been formally sanctioned, stripped of certain trade privileges, and required to publicly acknowledge the mistreatment Ren had suffered, a resolution that satisfied neither Garrick's pride nor Ren's lingering sense of unfinished business, but one that at least ensured no other child in his household would suffer as she had. The village where Elowen now lived was small, quiet, tucked into a valley far removed from the politics and power struggles of pack life. Ren felt her heart pounding as their carriage rolled to a stop outside a modest cottage at the village's edge, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the cool afternoon air. "You do not have to do this alone," Kale said softly, taking her hand as they approached the door. "I know," Ren said, grateful beyond words for his steady presence beside her. but I think I need to see her by myself, at least at first. Just for a moment. Cale nodded, understanding immediately, and stepped back to wait near the carriage as Wren approached the cottage door alone. Her hand shook as she raised it to knock, every instinct in her body torn between hope and the deep, old fear of rejection that had shaped her entire life. The door opened, and Wren found herself looking into a face achingly familiar despite having no clear memory of it, a woman with the same dark hair, the same set of the jaw, eyes that widened with immediate, unmistakable recognition the moment they landed on her. "Wren," the woman breathed, her voice cracking with an emotion so raw it stole the air from Wren's lungs. "They told me your name would be different. I did not dare hope that they would ever let you choose your own." "You know who I am," Wren said, her voice unsteady. "You recognized me instantly." "I would recognize you anywhere," Elowen said, tears already streaming down her face. "I have carried your face in my memory every single day since they took me from you. I never stopped searching for a way back, but Garrick's father made certain I could never return, made certain that any attempt would only bring further harm to both of us." The two women stood in the doorway for a long, trembling moment, 19 years of separation, and unanswered questions hanging heavy between them. Then, almost simultaneously, they closed the distance, and Wren found herself wrapped in an embrace she had spent her entire life aching for, without ever fully understanding what she was missing. "I thought you abandoned me," Wren admitted through tears, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "I grew up believing I was not wanted, not even by the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally." "Never," Elowen said fiercely, pulling back just enough to hold Wren's face in her hands. "Never, for one single moment, did I stop wanting you. I fought them. I begged. I did everything within my power, but I was an omega, with no standing, no protection, and they made certain my voice meant nothing at all." She wiped at her own tears, studying Wren's face as though trying to memorize every year she had missed. "Tell me everything. Tell me who you have become. Tell me how you survived. Tell me everything I was not there to witness." They spoke for hours, sitting together in the small cottage, as the afternoon light shifted slowly into evening, Wren sharing the painful details of her childhood, while Elowen listened with a grief so visible it seemed to physically weigh upon her shoulders. When Wren finally spoke of Cale, of the moment he had knelt beside her in the mud, of the declaration he had made in front of an entire hall of witnesses, Elowen's expression shifted into something like disbelieving wonder. "He truly did that? Publicly? In front of Garrick himself?" "He did," Wren confirmed. "He has not stopped fighting for me since. He is the one who found you, who insisted on searching until we had an answer." Elowen glanced toward the window, where Cale still waited patiently near the carriage, giving them the space they needed. "Bring him in," she said softly. "I would like to properly thank the man who gave my daughter the life I always dreamed she might have." That evening, as the three of them shared a simple meal in the small cottage, Wren felt something settle deep within her chest, a wound she had carried for 19 years finally, carefully, beginning to heal. She was not the same girl who had knelt in the mud without a name, without a history, without anyone to claim her as their own. She was Wren, chosen and claimed by a mate who refused to let injustice stand unaddressed, and reunited, against every expectation she had once carried, with a mother who had never once stopped loving her, even from a distance neither of them had chosen. The peace Wren found in reuniting with her mother did not last uninterrupted. Barely 2 weeks after their return to the Ashbourne estate, word arrived that Alpha Garrick, humiliated by the public reckoning Cale had forced upon his household, was attempting to rally support among several neighboring packs, spreading a narrative that painted Wren as a manipulative opportunist, and Cale as a king, whose judgment had been clouded by an unnatural obsession, unbefitting his position. "He is desperate," Cale said grimly, reading through a stack of reports his advisors had gathered from various territories. His trade privileges were stripped, his reputation damaged, and rather than accept accountability, he has decided the easiest path forward is to discredit you entirely. Wren felt a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, old fears resurfacing despite the progress she had made in recent months. What happens if people believe him? If enough allied packs decide I truly am unworthy of your position? "They will not," Cale said firmly. though Ren could see the concern beneath his composed exterior. But I will not pretend this is not dangerous. Alliances built on perception can be fragile things, and Garrick understands that fragility better than most. Mira, who had grown close to Ren over the preceding months, found her later that evening in the estate's garden, sitting alone beneath a blossoming tree, her expression troubled. "You look as though the weight of the entire kingdom rests on your shoulders," Mira said gently, settling onto the bench beside her. "Sometimes it feels that way," Ren admitted. "I spent so long being told I was worthless that some part of me still expects everyone to eventually agree with that assessment. Garrick is simply saying aloud what I always feared was true." Mira took her hand, her expression firm. "Listen to me, my lady. I have watched you these past months. I have seen the way you treat every member of this household with genuine kindness, regardless of their rank. I have seen the courage it took for you to face your own painful history publicly, rather than hiding from it. Garrick's words are not truth. They are the desperate attempt of a man trying to protect his own reputation by tearing down someone who dared to survive the harm he caused." Ren absorbed her words slowly, feeling some of the old anxiety ease, though not entirely disappear. "I do not want to simply hide here and let others fight this battle for me. I want to face it directly, the way I did with my mother." When she brought this idea to Cale that evening, he studied her carefully, clearly weighing the risks. "What do you have in mind?" "A gathering," Ren said, the plan solidifying in her mind as she spoke. "Not a private council, but something public. Something that allows representatives from the allied packs to hear the truth directly from me, rather than relying on whatever version of events Garrick chooses to spread." "That is a considerable risk," Cale said carefully. "Standing before skeptical alphas, defending your own history publicly, is not something I would ask of you." "You are not asking," Ren said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I am choosing this. I spent 19 years having every decision about my life made without my input. I do not intend to let this be another one." Cale's expression shifted into something that looked remarkably like pride. "Then we will make the arrangements together." The gathering was held 3 weeks later, drawing representatives from nearly a dozen allied packs to the great hall of the Ashbourne estate, a hall considerably grander and more imposing than the one Ren had once stood against as an invisible servant. This time, however, she did not stand against the wall. She stood at the center of the room, beside Cale, dressed not in the elaborate finery of a queen, but in simple, elegant attire that felt authentically her own. "I understand," Ren began, her voice carrying across the hushed hall with more steadiness than she had expected, "that questions have been raised about my history, and about the legitimacy of the bond I share with your king. I would rather answer those questions directly than allow rumor to answer them incorrectly on my behalf." She spoke then, calmly and without embellishment, of her childhood, of the name that had been denied her, of the mother taken from her through a cruelty that had nothing to do with her own worth, and everything to do with a household's desperate protection of its reputation. She spoke of the moment Cale found her in the mud, of the choice she made to place her hand in his, freely and without coercion, understanding fully what she was choosing. "I did not seek out this position," she said, her eyes finding Garrick's representative among the gathered crowd, a stiff-postured emissary who shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "I did not manipulate my way into a crown I never once dreamed of wearing. I was simply, for the first time in my entire life, seen as a person worthy of basic dignity, and I chose to accept the life that recognition offered me. If that choice troubles anyone in this room, I would ask them to examine honestly whether their discomfort stems from genuine concern, or from an unwillingness to accept that worth is not determined by birth, or wealth, or the number stitched onto a piece of cloth." The hall remained silent for a long moment after she finished, and then, slowly, one of the visiting alphas, an older woman from a distant northern pack, rose to her feet. "I have heard enough," she said firmly. "Any concerns I carried about this bond have been thoroughly answered. I extend my full support to Queen Ren and King Cale, and I would encourage this gathering to do the same." One by one, the other representatives followed her example, offering their own words of support, and Ren felt the tension that had gripped her chest for weeks finally begin to release. Garrick's emissary remained conspicuously silent, unable to counter the truth she had laid bare before witnesses, who now understood the full weight of what had been done to her. Later that night, alone in their chambers, Cale pulled her close, his expression full of an admiration that still, even now, made her breath catch. "You did not need me to fight that battle for you at all," he said softly. "You handled it entirely on your own strength." "I could not have found that strength without you," Ren said honestly. "Without someone finally believing I deserved a voice worth hearing." "You always deserved that," Kale said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I simply gave you the platform. The strength was always yours." Despite the overwhelming support Ren received from the gathered alphas, Alpha Garrick remained unwilling to accept the collapse of his campaign quietly. Reports reached the Ashbourne estate a month later that he had begun making arrangements to travel north personally, ostensibly to negotiate trade terms with a neighboring territory, but his actual route, according to Kale's informants, would take him dangerously close to the small village where Elowyn now lived. "He knows where she is," Kale said, his expression darkening as he studied the reports spread across his desk. "He must have discovered it through the same channels I used to find her, and now he intends to use her as leverage against you." Ren's blood ran cold. What could he possibly hope to accomplish? "Fear, most likely," Kale said grimly. "If he cannot discredit you through rumor, perhaps he believes he can threaten you into silence through your mother's safety instead." Ren did not hesitate. "We need to go to her. Now, before he arrives." They traveled north with an urgency that made the journey feel considerably shorter than their previous trip. Arriving at the small village just as evening settled over the valley, Elowyn greeted them with visible surprise, quickly turning to concern as Kale explained the situation. "I will not run again," Elowyn said firmly. Her jaw set with a determination Ren recognized instantly as her own. "I spent 19 years being forced from the life I wanted. I refuse to be forced from this one as well." "You may not need to run," Kale said carefully. "But I do not intend to leave either of you vulnerable to a man who has already proven he will use whatever cruelty is available to him." They did not have long to wait. Garrick arrived at the village 2 days later, his entourage considerably smaller than his usual traveling party, a fact Kale noted with quiet suspicion. "He is not here for trade negotiations," Kale murmured, watching from the cottage window as Garrick's carriage rolled to a stop in the village square. "He is here for confrontation." Garrick's confrontation, when it came, was not the dramatic threat Ren had feared, but something colder, more calculated. He arrived at Elowyn's cottage alone, his expression carefully composed into something almost pleasant, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Elowyn," he said, his voice carrying false warmth. "It has been many years. I trust you have been well, all things considered." "State your purpose, Garrick," Elowyn replied coldly, standing firmly beside Ren, rather than retreating from the doorway. "You did not travel this far north for pleasantries." Garrick's polite mask slipped slightly. "Very well. I am here to offer a resolution. Your daughter's public accusations have caused considerable damage to my household's reputation. I am prepared to offer compensation, a generous settlement, that would allow all of this unpleasantness to be quietly resolved, in exchange for a public retraction." "A retraction of the truth," Ren said sharply, stepping forward. "You want me to lie, in front of the same alphas I already spoke honestly to, simply to protect your reputation?" "I want this matter resolved," Garrick said, his composure cracking further. "My household standing among the allied packs has suffered greatly because of this scandal. Surely you understand the position you have placed me in." "The position you have placed yourself in," Kale interjected, stepping forward with an authority that made Garrick visibly stiffen. "No one forced you to deny a child her name. No one forced your father to tear a mother from her infant daughter. You created this scandal through your own cruelty, and I will not allow you to shift that responsibility onto the people you harmed." Garrick's gaze flickered between Kale, Ren, and Elowyn, clearly recalculating his approach now that his offer had been so thoroughly rejected. "You misunderstand my intentions, Your Majesty. I did not come here to threaten anyone. I merely hope to find a peaceful resolution before this conflict escalates further and damages the broader stability between our territories." "The only escalation here," Kale said evenly, "would come from you attempting to intimidate my mate's family in a village far from any formal protection. Rather than addressing your grievances through proper channels, I would advise against continuing down that path." The threat in Kale's voice, quiet but unmistakable, seemed finally to penetrate Garrick's dwindling composure. He glanced once more at Ren, something almost like genuine confusion crossing his features, as though he still could not fully comprehend how a nameless servant girl had risen to a position powerful enough to withstand his every attempt at intimidation. "This is not over," Garrick said finally, though the conviction in his voice had noticeably weakened. "I will find another way to restore my household's standing." "You are welcome to try," Ren said, her voice steady and unafraid, in a way that would have been unimaginable to her even a few months earlier. "But you will not find it through threatening my family. Every attempt you make will only further confirm exactly the kind of man I described to those gathered alphas. I would think carefully before continuing down this road." Garrick left without another word, his entourage following him back toward the village square, and Ren felt the tension that had gripped her chest finally begin to release as his carriage disappeared down the road leading south. "He will not stop trying to find leverage," Cale said quietly, watching the carriage vanish into the distance. "Men like Garrick rarely accept defeat gracefully." "Then we will face whatever he attempts next, together," Ren said, taking both Cale's hand and her mother's, standing between the two people who had given her a life she once believed impossible. "I am no longer the girl who had to face every hardship alone. Whatever comes, I have people beside me now who will not let me fall." That night, as they sat together in Eloin's small cottage, sharing a simple meal beneath the warm glow of candlelight, Ren felt something she had rarely experienced throughout her difficult childhood, a genuine, unshakable sense of safety. Garrick's threats, however persistent, no longer held the power to unravel her. She had survived far worse than his desperate attempts at intimidation, and she had emerged from that survival, not diminished, but stronger, surrounded now by people who refused to let her stand alone against whatever challenges still lay ahead. Spring arrived in the Ashbourne territory with a warmth that seemed, to Ren, to mirror everything that had changed within her over the preceding months. Garrick's threats had gradually faded into irrelevance, his attempts to rally support among the allied packs having failed so completely that even his own household reportedly began questioning his judgment. Cale's advisors confirmed that his political influence had diminished considerably, a consequence entirely of his own making, and one Ren no longer spent her energy worrying over. The formal mating ceremony, delayed through the months of upheaval that followed their initial declaration, was finally scheduled for the height of spring, when the gardens surrounding the Ashbourne estate bloomed in full, vibrant color. Ren stood in her chambers on the morning of the ceremony, studying her reflection in a mirror, far grander than any she had ever owned, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Gone was the gaunt, exhausted servant girl who had knelt in mud without a name to call her own. In her place stood someone she was still, in many ways, learning to become, dressed in a gown that blended traditions from both her mother's Hallowmere heritage and Cale's Ashbourne kingdom, a deliberate choice meant to honor every part of the journey that had brought her to this moment. "You look every bit the queen you were always meant to become," Eloin said softly, adjusting a final strand of Ren's hair, tears already gathering in her eyes despite the joy of the occasion. "I only wish I could have been there for every year in between, to watch you grow into this." "You are here now," Ren said gently, taking her mother's hands. "That is what matters most." Mira appeared in the doorway, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "It is time, my lady. Everyone is gathered, and the king awaits." The ceremony was held in the estate's largest garden, beneath an archway of blooming flowers that Mira and the household staff had spent weeks preparing. Representatives from every allied pack that had once questioned Ren's worthiness now sat among the gathered guests, having witnessed firsthand her strength and grace in the months since that difficult public gathering. Even a small handful of Draven household staff had traveled to attend, servants who remembered Ren from her years working alongside them, their presence a quiet, meaningful acknowledgement of how far she had come. Cale waited for her beneath the archway, dressed in formal attire that could not entirely disguise the emotion visible in his gray eyes as she approached. Ren felt her own eyes fill with tears, overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of the moment. A girl once denied even the dignity of a name, now walking toward a future she had never dared to imagine possible. "You are certain," Cale murmured as she reached him, taking her hands in his, "that this is truly what you want?" "A lifetime bound to me, to this kingdom, to everything that comes with it. I have never been more certain of anything," Ren said, her voice steady despite the emotion thick in her throat. You gave me back everything that was taken from me, and then you gave me so much more besides. There is nowhere else I would rather be, and no one else I would rather stand beside." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of warmth and joy. Traditional vows exchanged beneath the blooming archway, the formal bonding ritual sealing what the mate bond had already established months earlier in that quiet kennel yard where two strangers first crossed paths. When Cale finally leaned in to seal their union with a kiss, the gathered crowd erupted into celebration, the sound washing over Wren like a wave of belonging she had spent her entire life aching for, without ever believing she would receive. Later that evening, as the celebration continued in the great hall, filled now with laughter and music rather than the tense silence that had once greeted her there, Wren found a quiet moment alone with Cale, on the same balcony where he had once promised to fight for her, regardless of political cost. "Do you remember," she said softly, leaning against the railing beside him, "what you told me? The very first time we spoke? You asked who looked after me, and I did not know how to answer." "I remember," Cale said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It was the first moment I understood how deeply this household had failed you. I promised myself, in that instant, that I would spend the rest of my life making certain you never had to answer that question alone again. You have kept that promise," Wren said, resting her head against his shoulder as she looked out over the moonlit gardens below. "Every single day since." "I intend to keep it for the rest of our lives," Cale said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You are no longer nameless, Wren. You are no longer unwanted, or overlooked, or treated as though you do not matter. You are my queen, my mate, and the truest partner I could have ever hoped to find." Wren closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment settle fully into her bones, allowing herself, completely and without reservation, to believe in the life stretched out before her. She thought of the girl she had once been, kneeling in mud, answering to a number instead of a name, believing herself unworthy of even the smallest kindness. That girl had survived, had endured years of cruelty with a quiet, unbroken resilience, and that resilience had ultimately led her here, to a garden full of blooming flowers, standing beside a man who had seen her worth from the very first moment their paths crossed. She was Wren now, chosen freely, loved completely, and finally, after a lifetime of being told she was nothing, exactly where she was always meant to be,